What happens when the loudest art critic in Europe insults a painting, only to discover it was made by Keanu Reeves and praised by Prince William? Keep watching. To the end, you won't believe how it all unfolds. The rain had stopped. Just minutes before the guests began arriving outside the east wing of Windsor Castle, the cobbled drive glistened under the golden evening light. Luxury cars whispered to a halt beneath the arched portico, their doors swinging open to reveal men in tailored velvet jackets and women wrapped in cascading silk gowns, their heels clicking like clockwork across the stone. But despite the glamour, there was something quieter, subtler about tonight's affair, an unspoken reverence in the air. This wasn't just another gala. It was the Royal Horizon private art benefit, and no one came here unless they had either power money or an audience with the crown. Inside the gallery, wing walls draped in soft moire and lit by golden sconces played host to a curated exhibition unlike any other. These weren't paintings signed by household names. In fact, many had no names at all, just initials, symbols, or silence that was part of the mystery. Tonight's event wasn't about brand name brushstrokes. It was about rediscovering meaning, truth through anonymity. The invitation itself had said, "So come not to recognize names, but to recognize what still moves you." Of course, Dr. Felix Harrow hadn't taken that line seriously, a professor emeritus of the Royal Academy and one of Europe's most feared art critics. Felix didn't believe in mystery. He believed in control, in form, in technique, in power, and tonight he believed he'd be the most important man in the room. He arrived precisely at 7:42 p.m., 2 minutes after the reception opened, just long enough to make people notice his entrance. His coat was deep charcoal, his glasses rimless and sharp. He walked with the confidence of someone who'd destroyed more reputations than he'd praised. The staff greeted him with hushed bows. A waiter offered champagne. He declined with a nod, and his gaze immediately began dissecting the gallery, like it was a crime scene. But there was someone else already inside, someone who didn't walk with that same calculated certainty. A man stood quietly near the far end of the hall, dressed in dark jeans and a wrinkled button-up shirt. One hand tucked in his pocket, the other holding a glass of still water. He moved without effort, observing a painting with such stillness it was almost reverent. He didn't mingle, he didn't speak, he didn't even seem to belong. And yet he was there. Felix barely glanced at him, some assistant perhaps, or a last-minute donor's +1, whatever he was. Felix didn't think twice. He turned toward a nearby painting and let out a quiet, performative hum, something between contemplation and boredom. Behind him, voices whispered with polite excitement. Somewhere just out of sight, a royal aide whispered into an earpiece, "The prince has arrived." And at the far corner of the room, Keanu Reeves took a slow sip of his water and continued looking at the painting. If the night hadn't even begun yet, but it had. The piece was strange. It hung slightly off-center on a taupe-paneled wall away from the grand canvases that screamed for attention. No nameplate, no gilded frame, just a modest square of canvas roughly 24 inches across, edged with visible staples. Its brushstrokes, bold and imprecise, swirls of dark indigo tangled with strokes of crimson and raw sienna, punctuated by what looked like was that ash burn marks at the bottom right corner. Barely noticeable unless you were looking at 2 simple initials. Most guests had passed it by with a distracted glance. Too small, too raw, too out of place among the Monet tributes and Baroque modernism surrounding it. But one man had stopped. Keanu Reeves stood in front of the painting, with the quiet reverence of someone watching. The tide roll in, he wasn't analyzing. He was feeling, absorbing something, in the disorder of the piece made him tilt his head, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in critique, but connection. That was when Dr. Felix Harrow stepped in with the practiced air of a seasoned assassin. Felix approached the same painting and let out a low, amused hum. Well, he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for those within earshot. "Every event has one of these, doesn't Keanu didn't look away from the painting. Felix stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back. A brave attempt at abstraction, very emotional. He leaned in slightly, squinting burn marks too, how avant-garde. Then louder, I suppose someone mistook trauma for technique. A few nearby guests turned their heads drawn to the sound of performance. Keanu finally glanced over at the man beside him. His voice, when it came, was soft, measured. Sometimes trauma is the technique. Felix turned to face him fully, brows raised. Are you a collector? Keanu shook, his head once just looking. Felix smiled the way a fencing master smiles before delivering a point. Well, then allow me to enlighten your evening this. He gestured grandly toward the piece is what I call expressive confusion, amateur brushwork, incoherent composition, a diary entry disguised as art. Keanu didn't reply, he simply turned his gaze back to the painting. Felix took the silence as a cue to continue. I've taught for 30 years at the Academy, curated private collections across 3 continents. And let me tell you, this isn't art. This is therapy with a price tag. A few nearby attendees chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or back away. Keanu's lips curled almost imperceptibly. Maybe sometimes therapy is what the world needs. That made Felix pause for a beat, just long enough to feel it. The moment someone refused to play his game, but then he recovered. Touching sentiment, he said dryly, already pulling out his phone. Let's hope no one mistakes this for genius. He snapped a photo and began typing, likely crafting some caustic post. Keanu stepped aside, letting him work. He didn't need to argue. Not tonight, the painting would speak for itself eventually. Are you still watching? Leave 6 in the comments, so we know you're right here with us. The glow of Felix Harrow's phone cast a faint reflection on his wine glass as he typed. Each word was calculated, sharpened, lethal, spotted at Windsor tonight. The obligatory disaster piece burnt, canvas, chaotic swirls, and enough misplaced angst to fuel a first-year drama course. The revolution will not be framed, art or accident therapy on canvas. With a final flick of his thumb, he posted it to his massive following. Curators, collectors, galleries, gossip, accounts within seconds, likes and comments began to trickle in just as expected. Digital applause, affirmation. He sipped his wine and turned slightly, making sure the screen of his phone was visible to the woman beside him, an interior designer from Mayfair. He vaguely remembered from the Venice Biennale. She chuckled politely, not too loud, just enough across the room. Keanu Reeves still stood near the painting, still watching, still calm. Felix couldn't help himself. Poor man, he said, motioning toward Keanu. Looks like someone dragged him out of a farmer's market. Mid-poem, a nearby art dealer laughed too quickly, sensing this was the orbit to be in. Felix's continued voice now elevated just enough to travel every year. Someone tries to sneak something like this in paintings without training. Intent, or let's be honest. Talent, and the worst part. The pity bids, oh how we applaud. Mediocrity when it comes cloaked in authenticity. Keanu didn't flinch. He had moved slightly to the side, giving another guest space to admire the same painting. A woman mid-30s, soft-spoken, clearly new to this crowd, stood beside him, eyes fixed on the canvas. I think it's haunting. She whispered more to herself than anyone. Felix turned towards her like a wolf, scenting blood. Oh, it's haunting. All right, he said, haunting in the way an unpaid parking ticket is annoying, unresolved, and easily forgotten. The woman blushed, stepped back, and muttered an apology before walking away. Felix smirked and raised his glass in mock salute to her retreat. Keanu watched all of this quietly, not intervening, not correcting, just being, and that silence. It unnerved Felix more than he cared to admit. You know, Felix added, turning toward him now, if you're going to defend this, at least have the courage to say you painted it. Keanu looked at him level and unblinking. I don't need to defend it, he said. Some things don't ask for permission to exist, but buried among the noise was one comment that hadn't been there before, careful. "Felix, not every canvas is yours to judge." He stared at it for a moment, brow furrowing, then dismissed it with a scoff. The night was still young, and he was still the loudest voice. In the room, at least for now. Felix Harrow moved through the gallery like a conductor in his element, hands behind his back. Chin lifted, orchestrating glances and whispers with every step. He paused now and then for a quick comment. Part critique, part performance, a brushstroke dismissed. Here a composition corrected in theory, a color palette declared exhausted, and everywhere he walked, a polite orbit formed around him. Designers, diplomats, dilettantes, laughing too lightly, nodding too quickly. But the man in the wrinkled button-up remained a quiet contradiction. He had moved to the far end of the gallery, now away from the spotlight and the echo chamber. There he stood before a minimalist sculpture, 3 rusted iron beams balanced against each other like fallen trees after a storm. While most had passed it by without a second glance, the stranger observed it, with the same quiet attention he had given the painting, before not analyzing. Just noticing, Felix caught sight of him again and frowned. There was something about the man's stillness that irritated him. Not defiance, not confidence, but presence, and it wasn't earned. Felix thought it wasn't deserved. Not in those clothes, not in those shoes, not with that posture. Too relaxed, too unconcerned, too certain that he didn't have to prove anything. A young attendee leaned toward Felix. "That man. Do you know who he is? He's been here since the doors opened." Felix didn't look. "I imagine he wandered in with the catering staff." The young man chuckled. "No. He had a guest tag. Same gold badge as the royal patrons." Felix raised an eyebrow. Then, "The vetting process is clearly slipping across the room." Keanu Reeves sipped his water again, eyes moving thoughtfully over the next piece, an ink drawing on torn paper. He made no move to photograph it, didn't reach for his phone. He simply stood in front of it for a long while, as if trying to understand something only the drawing could explain. Several guests had started noticing him now, not out of curiosity but uncertainty. The more he stayed silent, the more people whispered. Was he an eccentric billionaire, an obscure collector, a performance artist in disguise? His face was familiar to some, but only faintly, as if glimpsed through a memory or a screen. A couple glanced at him, then at each other. One woman pulled out her phone, brows creased. Felix pretended not to notice. Instead, he took another sip of wine and gestured toward the sculpture. The stranger had just studied looks like a scrap heap at a steel factory, he declared loudly. There was a ripple of forced laughter, but no one looked quite as amused as before. Keanu had already moved on, pausing briefly to speak to a volunteer near the back. An older woman holding a tray of name tags. She smiled at him warmly. Whatever he said, it made her laugh. Felix watched from across the room, wine glass trembling slightly in his hand. The man said almost nothing, and yet somehow the room was beginning to listen. The chandeliers dimmed with an elegant flicker. At first no one moved. The room, once buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses and murmured critiques, paused. Even Felix Harrow lowered his wine glass half an inch, brows lifting slightly, as the string quartet stopped mid-piece and the soft chime of a bell echoed through the marble corridor. Then, from the far end of the gallery, the doors opened. A hush swept over the space like silk. There was no fanfare, no trumpets. Just the quiet, assured footsteps of Prince William stepping into the room without distinction, calm. Only royalty could wear, without arrogance, dressed in a classic midnight blue tuxedo. He looked every bit the heir, but tonight there was something more grounded in his presence, as if he wasn't here for a ceremony, but for something personal. Guests straightened their spines. Conversations evaporated. Phones were subtly stowed, and Felix, ever the performer, gently adjusted his pocket square, turning slightly to ensure he was in full view should the prince's gaze pass by. He didn't notice that across the room, Keanu Reeves had quietly stepped aside. His posture relaxed, but respectful, his expression unreadable. The prince made his way to a small platform near the center of the room, just beneath the skylight, where the last of the twilight brushed gold across the gallery walls. A soft spotlight bathed him in warmth as he approached the microphone. He smiled. "Good evening," he said, and even that was enough to draw a few sighs of admiration. "Thank you all for being here tonight, not just to admire the art, but to support the heart behind it." Polite applause followed. Felix joined in clapping just loud enough to be heard, just long enough to be seen. William continued, "The Royal Horizon Foundation has always believed that art is more than expression, it's action, and tonight your presence, your generosity has made that belief real." Another round of applause, stronger this time. Felix leaned toward a woman beside him and whispered, "Now we wait for the big donor name drop. That's when the real theater begins." But the prince didn't announce any name. Not yet. Instead, he smiled again, this time softer. "There is someone here tonight," he said, "whose presence many of you may not have noticed, someone who didn't walk in with flashing cameras or designer suits, someone who asked for no spotlight, and yet whose contributions have quietly transformed this entire initiative." A murmur moved through the crowd. Felix blinked. Prince William's tone shifted slightly, reverent. Now he came not to impress, but to invest in schools, in families, in futures. And then the words, "like." To personally thank the artist behind several of tonight's most powerful pieces, and one of the largest private donors to our cause, Mr. Keanu Reeves. There was silence then, gasps, then all at once the room erupted, heads turned, jaws dropped, and Felix Harrow, for the first time that evening, had absolutely nothing to say. It was as if the room inhaled and forgot how to exhale for a second. Maybe two, no one moved. The name had landed like a thunderclap in a cathedral. Keanu Reeves, not whispered, not rumored, spoken aloud, confirmed by royalty, and then like a wave rolling backward, before it crashes, the silence shattered, chairs shifted, phones were discreetly pulled from clutches and pockets, some gasped. Others whispered to their neighbors as heads twisted in every direction, searching, where was he? Then someone pointed, just a subtle lift of the chin, and all eyes turned toward the far end of the gallery. He hadn't stepped forward. He hadn't raised a hand or smiled for recognition. Keanu Reeves simply stood where he had been all evening, next to the sculpture. Felix had dismissed, one hand still holding his glass of water, when he did move. It was with the same unhurried grace that had defined him all night. No rush, no drama, just presence. He gave the prince a small nod, humble, grounded, and slowly began, walking toward the front of the room. Applause broke out before he was halfway there, a polite at first, then heavier, louder, growing into something thunderous, the sound of realization, the sound of faces falling and reputations cracking. Felix Harrow sat frozen. He didn't clap, couldn't. His mind reeled, flashing back to every word he'd said in the last hour, every smirk, every insult, every arrogant jab, the painting, the post. A woman beside him leaned in and whispered, almost giddy, "Did you know it was him?" Felix couldn't even answer. Keanu reached the small platform and Prince William extended his hand. The two men shook, exchanging a few quiet words, their smiles warm and familiar, like old collaborators, rather than two men meeting for the first time. The prince turned back to the crowd. "Keanu has asked not to speak tonight, which is in perfect character, but I think his work on canvas and in the world has already said more than enough." Another wave of applause swept through the room. Keanu offered a single nod of thanks. Dramatic, not self-important, just human. Then he stepped down from the stage and returned to where he'd stood before, not to bask in the attention, but to disappear back into the quiet. And just like that, the room turned with him. The guests who had followed Felix's commentary minutes before now turned their backs. Murmurs of admiration rippled toward Keanu, not the critic. Smiles shifted direction, conversations reassembled, but this time around someone else. Felix could feel the attention, what was left of it slipping from his shoulders like a coat someone had tugged away. He looked at his phone. The post mocking the painting now had hundreds of comments. Only now they weren't clapping. They were calling him out. He set the phone down. For the first time in decades, Felix Harrow had become the one everyone was quietly judging. Felix Harrow didn't remember sitting down, but somehow he was back in his chair, shoulders squared, jaw tight, hands clasped in a practiced pose of indifference. The glass of wine in front of him remained untouched. It wasn't trembling, but it wanted to around him. The current had changed. Conversations still happened, but they no longer orbited around him. Where there had once been a steady trickle of guests hoping to be noticed by the great Felix Harrow, now there was only a quiet bubble of space, a social vacuum, like people weren't sure if standing too close might make them complicit in something they couldn't yet name. Across the gallery, Keanu Reeves was surrounded not by a crowd, but by something subtler: warmth, respect, a kind of gravitational pull that came not from performance but presence. He wasn't holding court. He wasn't posing for pictures. He wasn't even speaking much. He simply nodded when spoken to, listened with a gentle intensity that made people lean in, made them feel heard. One woman handed him a program for a signature. He politely declined. Instead, he offered a soft thank you and pointed back toward the artwork, as if to say that's the signature that matters. Felix watched all of it through the veil of his own disbelief. He could hear the murmurs now floating on the edges of the room like smoke. He was here the whole time. I didn't even realize it was him. Did you see that painting? The one he made. Felix Harrow called it a disaster piece. That last one made his stomach turn. Someone behind him laughed too loudly. Felix glanced over his shoulder. A pair of young critics from an online art blog whispering while staring at their phones. His name had become a headline, a punchline. His own commentary was being dissected, now replayed, screenshotted, quoted back with biting sarcasm. He looked down at his phone again. Ooh. Felix really missed the mark therapy on canvas, more like humility. In a frame, turns out, silence was louder than all his reviews combined. Felix swallowed hard. He had always believed in sharpness, in the authority of words, in wielding taste like a blade, but tonight, his edge had dulled in the face of something he hadn't accounted for: authenticity. Keanu hadn't corrected him, hadn't embarrassed him, hadn't even acknowledged the insult. And somehow that made it worse. Across the room, Keanu looked up for a brief moment. Their eyes met, not dramatically, not with any flourish, but in a brief flicker of recognition. Felix held the gaze longer than he meant to, searching for contempt, smugness, anything to confirm he'd been conquered. But Keanu just blinked, gave the faintest nod, and turned away. The nod wasn't pity, it wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more cutting. It was indifference, and in that moment, Felix Harrow realized the worst thing a room could do to you wasn't laughter. It was forgetting you were ever there. The gallery had resumed its rhythm, but the music had changed. The quartet played again, soft and unobtrusive, like a memory trying not to fade. Waiters moved between clusters of guests, offering champagne and canapés with delicate precision. People laughed gently, cautiously. Conversation returned, but now it flowed around a different center, where Felix Harrow once stood as the axis of critique. The room had quietly tilted, now it orbited around a man in an untucked shirt and scuffed leather boots who held no wineglass, made no proclamations, and had never once asked to be noticed. Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of the crowd, speaking quietly, with a young woman from a non-profit. His head was slightly bowed, his hands tucked in his pockets. Every now and then he'd smile, not the broad kind that begged for cameras, but a soft, fleeting curl of sincerity. The kind that made people lean in, the kind that made them stay. Felix watched from across the room, eyes narrowed, hands folded on his lap. He could still feel the echo of his words, the smug remarks, the jokes that now rang hollow. They clung to the walls like smoke from a fire. No one wanted to acknowledge. No one approached him now, not even to challenge him. And that somehow was the deepest cut of all. He wasn't villainized. He was dismissed, irrelevant. He caught a glimpse of the woman he'd mocked earlier, the one who had called the painting haunting. She was laughing now, standing beside Keanu, eyes lit with something unspoken. He hadn't corrected her, then hadn't defended her, but his silence had stood between her and Felix, like a wall no insult could pass through. And in that moment, Felix finally understood something brutal. Keanu didn't stay quiet because he lacked the words. He stayed quiet because he didn't need them. Where Felix had built a life on commentary, Keanu had dismantled an entire narrative, with nothing but stillness that was power, not the kind that demanded attention, the kind that commanded it. Felix stood slowly, his knees aching, in a way that felt symbolic. He thought of walking over, of extending a hand, of apologizing. But what would that do? The moment had passed. The damage had been done, and worse, it hadn't caused a ripple. The man he had ridiculed hadn't just recovered. He had never been wounded. He moved toward the rear of the gallery, weaving through the crowd. Without touching a single shoulder, no one turned, no one noticed. And when he reached the corridor leading toward the exit, he paused and glanced back. Keanu was laughing now, just slightly. His voice a low rumble beneath the music. Prince William had joined them. The two men speaking like old friends beneath a sculpture Felix had once called a rusted afterthought. He stared a moment longer, then turned away, not defeated but something worse, forgotten. The corridor was quiet, muted light spilled from the chandeliers above, casting Felix Harrow's reflection across the gilded mirrors lining the wall. The laughter and conversation from the gallery behind him grew fainter, with each step replaced by something heavier, slower. An ache he couldn't name. He paused beside the coat room, not ready to leave, not willing to return, just suspended between two places, two versions of himself. One had walked into the gallery tonight, sure of his importance. The other had just watched that importance evaporate like mist from glass. He stared at his reflection. Same suit, same posture, same tailored lines, silver cufflinks, polished shoes. And yet something was missing. It wasn't status. He still had the title, the lectures, the columns. It wasn't a reputation, at least. Not yet. His critics would soften the blow frame tonight as a misstep, a misunderstanding. But deep down, beneath the vanity and vocabulary, Felix Harrow knew what had shifted. It was the room, and once the room turned from you, it never turned back. His phone buzzed again. He didn't check it. He knew what it would be. Messages from assistants, PR handlers, perhaps even a few sycophants, telling him it wasn't that bad. But the silence in the gallery, the way people had laughed without him, moved without him, admired without him, was worse than scandal. It was dismissal, and there was no recovering from that. Far down the hallway, he could still hear the hum of conversation, the soft pull of a string quartet, drifting between the marble and velvet. Keanu's voice floated through low, thoughtful, unhurried. Prince William was laughing beside him. A camera flash lit the hallway for a brief moment, like lightning in a distant sky. Felix didn't return. There would be no dramatic apology, no reclaiming of the stage. Just this: a man once feared for the sharpness of his words, standing alone in a corridor, finally realizing that the quietest person in the room had held all the power, and he had never needed to raise his voice. Felix turned toward the mirror again and whispered more to the echo than to himself. Sometimes you're not silenced, you're simply not listened to anymore. And that was worse. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved his invitation card, creased now, slightly torn at the corner. He turned it over on the back. In elegant silver script was the original event quote: "Come not to recognize names, but to recognize what still moves you." He stared at it for a long time, then slowly, almost reverently, folded it once and slipped it into his breast pocket. He walked to the exit. No one followed. No one noticed, and as the doors closed behind him with the softest of clicks, the only sound. Left was the music continuing without him. The gallery had begun to empty slowly, like waves pulling back from the shore after a quiet storm. The guests drifted out, heels clicking on marble voices soft with wine and reflection. A few lingered near the sculpture halls discussing color theory or fundraising numbers. But the air had shifted. The night was no longer about art or fashion or the critic who had tried to dominate the room. It was about something else now. Presence. At the far end of this gallery, Keanu Reeves remained for a moment longer. He stood beside one of the smaller paintings. A watercolor piece hidden in a corner overlooked by most. He didn't speak. He didn't pose for cameras. He just stood there as if saying goodbye to something no one else could see. And then quietly, he turned and walked away, not triumphantly, not sometimes, just a man waiting for the world to catch up. We are so quick to judge what we don't recognize, so eager to speak before we understand. But tonight, one truth echoed louder than any applause. Respect isn't earned by what you say. It's shown by how you choose to say nothing. Keanu didn't need to defend himself. He didn't raise his voice, didn't call out injustice, didn't embarrass anyone. And yet by the end of the night, he had said everything that mattered. What about you? Have you ever judged someone too quickly and regretted it? If this story made you feel something, drop 8 in the comments, share. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think we're listening.